You know, it has always amused me how we human beings imagine that the height of consciousness, this marvelous capacity to reflect upon ourselves, should somehow guarantee a life of constant delight, as though the more aware you become, the more you ought to enjoy your morning tea, your afternoon walk, or the soft rustle of leaves brushing against the window. But strangely enough, the opposite often seems to happen. Many who grow more conscious, more observant, more inwardly attentive, find that the simple pleasures of life slip through their fingers like water through a tight fist. And the oddity of it all is that the more tightly they grasp, the less they seem to hold. You see, when you become acutely aware of the workings of your own mind, its anxieties, its expectations, its endless evaluations, you can't help but notice that every experience is instantly followed by a commentary. It is as though you've not only gone to the theatre, but also brought along a critic who insists on reviewing the play before it has even begun. You taste a peach, and instead of just tasting it, you wonder whether you're tasting it correctly, whether this moment is as meaningful as it should be, whether someone else might savour it more profoundly than you. And in that moment, the peach is no longer a peach. It becomes an item on a checklist of spiritual achievement. Now, the trouble is not the consciousness itself. Consciousness is a delightful trick of the universe, its way of seeing itself from within. The trouble arises when consciousness forgets to play, when it grows too solemn, too stiff, too intent on being conscious. It begins to miss the very thing it is meant to illuminate. Imagine a dancer who becomes so aware of her own steps that she forgets to move with the music. She begins calculating angles, measuring distances, rehearsing her smile. And while the technique may be impeccable, the dance is lifeless. She has become separated from the rhythm that once carried her effortlessly. In much the same way, many thoughtful people become divided within themselves. They are both the dancer and the evaluator, the experiencer and the watcher of the experiencer, constantly whispering in their own ear, "Is this enough? Am I doing it right? Shouldn't I feel more joy, more serenity, more appreciation?" And while that whisper may seem harmless, it is precisely the sort of noise that drowns out the very pleasures they seek. Because simple pleasures are shy creatures. They appear only when they are not hunted. And so the puzzle deepens. Why is it that the more aware we become, the more easily these quiet joys slip away? It is because consciousness, when clutched too tightly, becomes self-consciousness, a kind of inner spotlight, always shining back on itself, turning every gesture into a performance. What was once spontaneous becomes staged. What was once natural becomes effortful. Think of a child playing in a garden. Before you call out to them, they are utterly absorbed in the crackle of dry grass, the wobble of a beetle on a leaf, the grand adventure of simply being alive. But call their name, tell them to keep playing just like that, and watch how suddenly they falter. Their shoulders tighten. They begin to wonder how one is supposed to play correctly. The effortless flow evaporates. This is what happens when adults awaken to their own awareness, but forget how to let it breathe. They tell themselves, stay present, stay mindful, stay deeply involved with life. And in doing so, they create a tension that squeezes joy out of the very moments they are trying to savor. Presence cannot be commanded. It must be allowed. You cannot force yourself to enjoy a sunset. The moment you try, enjoyment evaporates. The sunset, after all, is simply there. Its colors do not beg for your appreciation. They do not know whether you are happy or sad, enlightened or confused. The sky has never once asked to be impressive. It is simply painting itself across the horizon. And whether you look in wonder or look away, it continues in its own mysterious way. But the conscious person, striving to be ever attuned, brings a peculiar demand into the picture. They expect experience not only to happen, but to be satisfied. They want the cup of tea to whisper secrets of the universe. They want a casual conversation to contain layers of cosmic meaning. They want every moment to affirm that they are living correctly, wisely and beautifully. What a burden to place on a morning cup of tea. You see, the so-called problem is not that conscious people cannot enjoy simple pleasures. It's that they expect simple pleasures to be something more than simple. They want them to be gateways to revelation, to transformation, to some grand confirmation that their inner work has paid off. And so, instead of sipping the tea, they interrogate it. Instead of walking through the park, they monitor themselves. Walking through the park. Experience becomes a task rather than a happening. But a task can never replace a happening, because a task has a goal and a happening has none. A happening is free. And perhaps this is the twist in the tale. The more conscious you become, the more you begin to suspect that life should always feel like it is happening. You imagine that awareness should grant you a front row seat to the grand theatre of existence, where every moment is profound, every breath meaningful, every leaf a miniature revelation. But life is far more playful than that. It refuses to be profound in command. It refuses to shimmer just because you've decided to look closely. In fact, the closer you look, the more ordinary things appear, until you stop insisting they be extraordinary. Only then, quite unexpectedly, the extraordinary slips quietly back into the ordinary. Like a cat returning home when you finally stop calling its name. The conscious person, however, often stays in a kind of internal tug-of-war. On one side, there is the simple pleasure itself. A warm cup, a soft breeze, a small laugh. On the other side, there is the mind insisting, don't just enjoy it, observe the enjoyment, make sure it's meaningful. And suddenly the whole thing becomes twice removed from itself, like an echo commenting on an echo. It is as though we have built a balcony inside ourselves, and instead of dancing at the party, we stand above it, watching our own steps, critiquing our own rhythm, wondering whether we're doing it as gracefully as we should. The music plays on, but we have gone upstairs to inspect our own performance. And naturally, the dance loses its pulse. Simple pleasures are not performances. They're not spiritual achievements or measures of inner progress. They don't happen better just because you understand them deeply. If anything, understanding them too intensely can drain them of their lightness. For simple pleasures are feather-like. They float only when held loosely. Grip too tight and they collapse under the pressure of expectation. Imagine watching a candle flame. If you stare at it hoping for revelation, it will give you nothing. The flame will simply flicker as it flickers. But if you sit quietly with no demand for insight, the flicker becomes a tiny miracle. Not because you forced it to be, but because you allowed it to be nothing more than what it is. The conscious person's difficulty is that they are often too busy, checking whether they are having a genuine experience to have one at all. They become tourists in their own life, photographing every moment instead of living it, collecting memories instead of being present for the moments those memories are made of. And yet there is a way back, a gentle shift, a loosening of the grip. You see, the key is not to become less conscious, but to become conscious in a different way. An unself-conscious consciousness, if you like. A way of being aware that does not involve that constant internal supervision, that ceaseless monitoring of one's own experience. It is a kind of awareness that moves like water, fluid, unforced, without the slightest hint of strain. But this shift cannot be made by decree. You cannot tell yourself to let go and expect it to happen. Letting go is not an action. It's the cessation of unnecessary action. It's what happens when you finally tire of gripping the world so tightly, that your knuckles go white. Only then does the hand relax. Not because it was commanded to, but because it is simply weary of clenching. Consider the way you fall asleep. The more determined you are to fall asleep, the more sleep eludes you. You lie there with furrowed brows, thinking, I must relax, I must drift off. And in the very demand for sleep, you become too vigilant, too alert. But the moment you give up, truly give up, not as a strategy, but out of genuine exhaustion, sleep arrives on its own, like a gentle tide washing over a deserted shore. Simple pleasures function in much the same way. They are not rewards for effort. They are invitations to ease. But when you approach them with the intention of extracting enjoyment, they recoil. It's like trying to coax a bird to land on your hand while holding your fingers rigid with anticipation. The bird feels the tension, it senses the expectation. And so it stays perched on a distant branch, waiting for the moment when your hand softens, becomes warm, relaxed, unthreatening. Only then does it flutter closer. Awareness must be soft in this way. Open, receptive, but not demanding. Curious, but not hungry. Simple pleasures reveal themselves when consciousness stops insisting that life must be extraordinary. In that spaciousness, the ordinary becomes beautifully sufficient. Now, the interesting part is that most of us don't actually notice how tense our awareness has become. We assume that because our minds are active, we are awake. That is because we are analyzing our experience. We are participating in it. But analysis is not participation. Please do not modify it. A tight mind is not an attentive mind. It is a vigilant one. And vigilance, though useful in moments of danger, is terribly ill-suited for tea, poetry, morning light, or the laughter of a friend. The conscious person must learn the difference between openness and scrutiny, between awareness and surveillance, between being alive and checking whether one is alive. And once this difference becomes clear, even faintly, a curious transformation begins. You realize that consciousness is not meant to be held like a magnifying glass, forever inspecting the world. It is more like a window, transparent, unobtrusive, simply allowing life to be seen without interference. The moment you stop pressing your face against the glass, the view becomes astonishingly vivid. But the habit of pressing is strong. The habit of trying to have the right experience, to live with maximum awareness, to wring meaning out of every moment. These habits cling like old coats we no longer need, but continue to wear out of familiarity. The trick is not to rip them off in frustration, but to notice how heavy they've become, to feel how they weigh down even the gentlest pleasure. Think of those moments when you've laughed, truly laughed, without even realizing you were laughing. Maybe it was something absurd, something unexpected, something your serious mind never had time to evaluate. For a brief moment, you disappeared into the sound, into the spontaneity. You weren't observing yourself. You weren't analyzing your amusement. You were simply the laughter happening of its own accord. That is unself-conscious consciousness. That is the taste of simple pleasure in its purest form. But of course, once you notice it, the reflex returns. Ah, I did it. I finally enjoyed something naturally. And the moment you congratulate yourself, the moment you try to repeat it or hold on to it, the whole thing slips away like a dream when you try to recall it too quickly. You see, self-awareness is a marvelous tool, but a dreadful master. When it becomes too dominant, it turns life into a project, something to be optimized, perfected, achieved. But life is not a project. It is not a performance. It is not a riddle that you must solve before sunset. Life is much more like a melody. It does not ask to be completed. It asks to be played. The conscious person's difficulty stems from treating life as a task. They approach joy with a clipboard. They inspect beauty as though it were an examination. They enter moments of stillness with the same intensity they bring to a complex decision. And in doing so, they drown out the very lightness that simple pleasures require. To enjoy simplicity, one must become simple. Not in intellect, but in posture, a kind of inner unclenching. A willingness to let life be as it is, without demanding that it conform to the image you have of how an awakened person should feel. Because the truth is, life does not care whether you are awake or not. It moves on quietly, mysteriously, offering itself moment by moment, and there is a tremendous relief in finally moving with it, rather than trying to measure it. And when you begin moving with life, rather than inspecting it, something subtle shifts. So subtle, in fact, that you might miss it if you look too closely. It is the shift from trying to experience the moment to simply being the moment. A soft loosening in the chest, a quietening of that inner narrator who's always filing reports on your behalf. The world grows not louder but clearer, not more dramatic but more intimate. You might find yourself noticing the warmth of sunlight on your arm, not as an object of study, not as a mindfulness exercise, but simply because warmth is happening. You might hear the hum of distant traffic, not as a phenomenon to dissect, but as something that has always been part of the landscape of your living. These things were never hiding from you. You were simply too busy evaluating them to feel them. There is a great dignity in the ordinary, a dignity that does not ask to be admired. And when you stop demanding magnificence from the world, you discover a magnificence woven into every corner of it. The trick is that you cannot seek it. You can only stumble upon it by accident, the way you find a seashell while walking aimlessly along the shore. The more you search for it, the more elusive it becomes. This is why conscious people often feel estranged from simple pleasures. They have turned these pleasures into benchmarks of their own progress. They want their experience to reflect their understanding. They want their inner clarity to sparkle in the taste of soup, in the sound of rain. But the universe does not operate on a grading system. It does not reward insight with fireworks. It simply continues, offering the same quiet delights it always has. The truth is that simple pleasures were never muted. It was the mind that grew too loud, and this loudness, this constant hum of introspection, is a kind of tension that most of us carry without noticing. It sits behind the eyes, in the shoulders, in the way we hold our breath ever so slightly while trying to be present. But presence cannot bloom in a strained body. It emerges naturally when the body is no longer being commanded to be present. This is why the most beautiful moments in life often happen when we are unguarded, when we are not trying to be profound or centered or wise. They happen when we trip over our own seriousness and land, unexpectedly, in the simplicity of being alive. And once you taste that simplicity again, even for a second, you begin to understand that joy does not come from controlling the moment. It comes from being porous to it, open, unshielded, unstrategic. The conscious person's journey, then, is not toward deeper analysis, but toward deeper ease. But ease is frightening for many people, especially those who have cultivated a sharp, reflective mind. Ease feels like letting the guard down. It feels like stepping out from behind the familiar armor of thought. And thought, clever, articulate, endlessly industrious, whispers that if you stop watching yourself so closely, you might lose something essential. You might become careless. You might drift. Yet what a marvelous thing it is to drift. Not in the sense of being lost, but in the sense of floating, buoyed by the natural rhythm of your own existence. Simple pleasures float. They never march, they never demand. They never announce themselves with trumpets or grand revelations. They arise like ripples in a pond, responding effortlessly to the slightest movement of life, And you too are a ripple, an expression of the same living water. You do not need to force your way into harmony. You are already part of the pattern. The problem is not that conscious people think too much. It is that they believe their thinking must be involved in every moment. They have forgotten that awareness also has a body, a breath, a pulse. That awareness is not confined to the head. It resonates through the entire being. Watch a cat stretching in the sun. It is not trying to be present. It is not wondering whether the stretch is aligned with some greater purpose. It simply stretches, because stretching happens. And in that effortless gesture, there is a kind of wisdom more immediate than any philosophical insight. We humans, in our elaborate mental architecture, often overlook this simplicity. We imagine that joy must be earned, that pleasure must be justified, that being alive must be accompanied by a running commentary, explaining how well we're doing at it. But the commentary is the very thing that interrupts the song. Life hums a melody through everything. Traffic, wind, footsteps, conversations caught halfway. And you, trying so hard to listen, may miss it precisely because you're straining your ears. Relax the listening and suddenly the melody emerges. Not because you hunted it down, but because you finally stopped drowning it out with your own expectations. Simple pleasures begin returning the moment you release them from the burden of proving anything. The warmth of a cup in your hands does not need to be profound. The taste of fruit does not need to reveal the secrets of existence. A moment of stillness does not need to transform you. Pleasure is not something to be mastered. It is something to be received. And receiving is always easier than striving. And so the art, the gentle, subtle art, is not to abandon consciousness, but to let it mingle with the world, rather than hover above it, to let it fall back into its natural place, as the background hum of your being, rather than the harsh spotlight pointed at every passing moment. You may find, as you soften into this way of living, that the simplest things begin to glow again, not in a dramatic way, but in a familiar way, like an old friend whose presence you'd forgotten how to appreciate. The smell of rain on warm pavement, the texture of fabric between your fingers, the distant laughter of someone you'll never meet. These things do not need your analysis. They need only your openness. And openness is not something you cultivate. It is something that unfolds when you stop insisting on control. Consider a pond. When the surface is agitated, churned by wind, or stirred by a thrown stone, it distorts the reflection of the sky. But when it is still, even for a moment, the reflection appears effortlessly. The sky does not have to try to reflect itself. The pond does not have to struggle to receive the image. Stillness reveals what effort conceals. When conscious people try too hard to meet life with perfect awareness, they churn the pond. Their intentions are good, but the effort creates turbulence. The reflection becomes distorted precisely because they wanted it to be clear. And so the simple pleasure of the moment, its quiet beauty, its gentle honesty, becomes muddled by the very striving meant to enhance it. Relax the mind and the reflection returns on its own. This is the paradox. The more you chase simple pleasures, the farther they drift. But stop chasing and they come back like birds returning to roost in the evening light. So, if you find yourself unable to enjoy the little things, do not scold yourself. Do not try harder. Do not turn the moment into another exam. Instead, notice the tension. Feel the grip. Acknowledge the part of you that wants to hold life still long enough to study it. And then, but let it be. Let consciousness be a companion, not a supervisor. Let experience unfold without narrating itself. Let the world come to you in its own time, in its own shape, in its own quiet magnificence. For the great secret, if there is one, is that simple pleasures have never abandoned you. They were merely waiting for you to stop insisting on how they should feel, so they could show you how they naturally do feel. In that unguarded moment, unmeasured, unexamined, unforced, you rediscover what was always here. The subtle joy of being alive without needing to prove anything at all.